Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to dive into an incredible and honestly almost unbelievable mystery surrounding America's 25th president, William McKinley. We're going to look at exactly how a leader who completely transformed the global standing of the United States somehow became the forgotten architect of the American century. So, let's just get right into this central paradox. How did a man who ended a massive depression, won a global war, and literally built an empire just slide so gently into oblivion? Today, if he's remembered at all, he's mostly just known as the guy whose tragic death put Teddy Roosevelt in the White House. But at the time of his death, that wasn't the case at all. Because, and this is absolutely crucial to understand, his legacy was monumental. We're talking about a guy who steered the nation right out of its worst economic slump prior to the Great Depression. He oversaw a victorious, decisive war against a major European power, and he was incredibly popular. He was actually the first president to win a consecutive second term in a quarter of a century. When he passed away, the public fully assumed his name was going to be revered right up there alongside Abraham Lincoln. To understand why he was so wildly successful, well, we have to look at where he came from. Which brings us to Section 1, the Crucible: soldier, caretaker, and statesman. You know, McKinley's early life started out totally ordinary, but he was heavily shaped by his parents' ferocious belief in education and their uncompromising abolitionism. Born back in 1843 in Niles, Ohio, financial troubles actually forced young William to leave college and work as a postal clerk by age 16. But when the Civil War broke out, he signed up immediately, really driven by those strong abolitionist values. And as a private, the guy was almost suicidally brave. At Antietam, which remains the bloodiest single day in U.S. history, he charged straight through heavy enemy fire just to deliver supplies to the front line. This jaw-dropping zeal caught the eye of his commander, future President Rutherford B. Hayes, who ended up becoming his lifelong mentor. By 1865, that teenage postal clerk had returned home as a brevet major, which was an honorary promotion for his incredible courage. After the war, McKinley met the absolute love of his life, Ida Saxton, who was a highly educated and progressive woman, and they had this picture-perfect life, for a few short years anyway. But then came the darkest years. Between 1873 and 1875, unimaginable tragedy completely shattered their world. First, they lost their youngest daughter, then McKinley's mother passed away, and finally, they lost their older daughter. That massive combined grief just completely broke Ida's health, leaving her struggling with severe depression and epilepsy, and ultimately turning her into an invalid who needed constant round-the-clock care. And going through that level of personal tragedy profoundly humanized him. He became Ida's devoted lifelong caretaker. Actually, some of his final words after being assassinated years later perfectly capture this devotion. He said, "My wife, be careful how you tell her." His number one concern, right to the very end, was always Ida. He prioritized her comfort above literally everything else, even as his political star was rapidly rising in Washington. All right, moving on to Section 2, redefining American politics, the political earthquake of 1896. So, picture this. McKinley's political career is practically in ruins after a disastrous tariff in 1890 loses his party the House, and on top of that, a massive $100,000 personal bankruptcy nearly destroys him. But he bounces back by completely redefining how campaigns are run. His opponent in the 1896 election, the populist Democrat William Jennings Bryan, was basically playing an old game, just preaching to his traditional choir. McKinley, though, he built a completely modern big tent coalition right from his front porch. He was building something entirely new, drawing in traditional Democratic voters to form this completely revolutionary coalition. Let's break down exactly what that modern operation looked like, because it's pretty wild. Backed by the incredibly wealthy industrialist Mark Hanna, McKinley had a massive $4 million war chest. And instead of traveling himself to exhaustion like Bryan did, he stayed home and invited people to him. A staggering 750,000 people traveled to hear him speak from his front porch. And he didn't just give one generic stump speech either. He delivered 350 speeches, perfectly tailored to different groups: immigrants, Black Americans, Catholics, Jews, and traditional white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. It was a massive, unprecedented spin operation that just flooded the entire country with leaflets and campaign pens. And the crucial takeaway here is the result: 50%. Bam! The era of extremely narrow nail-biter victories was officially over. McKinley secured a massive mandate, becoming the first candidate since Ulysses S. Grant a quarter of a century earlier to win over 50% of the popular vote. It was a true political earthquake. Which leads us perfectly into Section 3, building an American empire, expansion and its costs. So, armed with that huge mandate, he steps into the White House. McKinley was actually the last Civil War veteran to become president, yet his time in office would be paradoxically dominated by a totally new conflict. And things escalated fast. In 1895, Spain forced 300,000 Cubans into concentration camps. The American public was understandably furious. McKinley tried diplomacy at first, but then, on February 15, 1898, the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, tragically killing 226 crewmen. By April, both nations declared war. And what's really fascinating here is how McKinley managed this conflict. He used newly installed telephones to command his generals in real time. That was a very modern tactic for the era. And it worked. By August 12, Spain was completely and utterly defeated, their Atlantic fleet was sunk, and their global grip was broken. The aftermath of that super short war completely reshaped the world map. Look at this shift. During the conflict, McKinley officially annexed Hawaii. Then, the peace treaty gave America possession of Puerto Rico and Guam. And most drastically of all, he pushed the Senate to purchase the Philippines for $20 million. With the signing of this treaty, the United States instantly became a global colonial power. No turning back. But of course, empire building comes with highly controversial realities and a deeply staggering human cost. 200,000. That is the estimated Filipino death toll resulting from the Filipino-American War that followed. When the U.S. claimed the islands, Filipinos fought back for their independence, leading to a brutal, deeply divisive conflict that forever defined this new American empire. Yet, for better or worse, these bold moves set the blueprint for a century. He annexed key territories, crushed the Philippine resistance, and even flexed American muscle over in Asia by sending troops to China's Boxer Rebellion, a violent anti-foreign uprising, and he did that entirely without congressional approval. Domestically, he embarked on a huge centralizing drive, restoring executive power over Congress. Basically, McKinley established the interventionist foreign policy and the powerful executive branch that would echo through World War I, World War II, and well beyond. And that brings us to our final chapter, Section 4, Assassination and Legacy. The Anarchist and the Cowboy. You know, it's wild to think about how a single choice ahead of the 1900 election would inadvertently seal McKinley's historical fate and eventually unravel his meticulously built legacy. After his original vice president died in office, war hero Teddy Roosevelt became the absolute favorite to join the ticket. Now, McKinley's old patron, Mark Hanna, aggressively opposed this. He completely despised Teddy's pugnacious macho style. But McKinley put his reservations aside, ignored the warnings, and gambled on Teddy's undeniable talent, adding him to the ticket. McKinley easily won re-election, for sure, but that specific choice would quickly become critical. Because tragedy was looming. Despite receiving death threats, McKinley basically ignored his security warnings, truly believing the American public meant him no harm. On September 6, 1901, at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, he insisted on staying out there and shaking hands with the public. That's when Leon Czolgosz, an anarchist, approached and shot the president twice in the stomach. Amazingly, McKinley remained conscious, and his first instincts were to beg the crowd not to hurt the shooter and to worry about how the news would affect his wife, Ida. After several tense days of everyone hoping he'd pull through, the grim horror of a pre-antibiotic world took hold. On September 14, William McKinley died of gangrene at the age of 58. And the immediate, just incredibly dark irony of his tragic death is captured perfectly by a grieving Mark Hanna, who reportedly said, "Now look, that damn cowboy is President of the United States." Which brings us to our final and, I think, most provocative question. Are we still living in the world William McKinley built? Today, he just sits in obscurity. Even Mount McKinley in Alaska was renamed back to Denali. There are very few monuments to him out there. Yet without him, the massive expansionist presidency of Teddy Roosevelt and, frankly, the modern interventionist United States as we know it would have been completely unthinkable. He fundamentally changed what the presidency could be and what the nation was on the global stage. He might be forgotten by the general public, but every modern president still operates within the powerful blueprint he designed. Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer, and we will see you next time.